Hey, good evening, everyone. My name is Alex Cooley. I'm the director of the Harriman Institute, and it's a real pleasure and a privilege to welcome you to today's event, Russia and the World, 25 years after the Soviet breakup. Here at Harriman, this is part of our 70th, 25th anniversary series. It's the 70th anniversary of the founding of our institute, along with SIPA back then. We're now part of Arts and Sciences, but our home was originally in SIPA. And we're also reflecting on the 25th anniversary of the Soviet collapse. And so we're holding a series of events that are designed to bring into bear this 25 years of what's happened and our understanding of what's happened. How do we think about it? How do we periodize this? Is this the post-something or something completely different now? And I think this takes even greater meaning given our own, I think it was Tariq Omar who tweeted, the United States now knows what it's like to be post-something, right? Not just sort of reserved for East European countries. Sorry, Tariq, I brought you into that. So this is a moment to reflect. And the idea behind this particular panel was to bring what I and I think a lot of people consider to be just leaders in their respective fields who are Russia watchers, Russia observers, Russia researchers. And here I think we have just three of the leading figures in their respective areas. So starting all the way to your right, Bobolo is an independent analyst. And he was previously director of the China and Russia programs of the Center for European Reform, head of the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House, and deputy head of the mission at the Australian Embassy in Moscow. And he writes extensively on Russian foreign policy. His latest book, Russia and the New World Disorder, from Brookings and Chatham House, was shortlisted for the 2016 Pushkin House Prize. And it was described by The Economist as perhaps the best attempt yet to explain Russia's unhappy relationship with the rest of the world. So that comes in handy. Some of you might also know him as author of Axis of Convenience, about the Russian-Chinese relationship, and he'll be reprising that tomorrow at noontime in a seminar. So welcome, Bobo. Ted Hoff has a Harriman link and a Harriman connection, though I just found out he hasn't been back for a really long time, so welcome back, Ted. We are absolutely thrilled and honored that you're back. He is the Provost Chair Professor of Political Science at National University of Singapore, in addition to numerous articles published in the best political science journals. He is the author of 6 books. His most recent, Reconstructing the Cold War, The Early Years, 1945-1958, won the 2013 award for Best Book in International Relations and History, and the 2013 Marshall Schulman Award. And his research has been supported by a number of foundations. He's a pioneer, really, in thinking about national identity and foreign policy and to how to come up with good theories and conceptualizations and measures. And so, in times like these, we are very grateful for his expertise. And then finally, Fiona Hill, who will be serving as our moderator and interlocutor today, is a director of the Center on the United States and Europe and a senior fellow in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution, and just got off a Fox News appearance talking about the future of Russia-U.S. relations. She has written extensively on regional conflicts, on Russian politics. You might know her best from her book, Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin, from the Brookings Institution Press, 2015. And has it been reissued, Fiona?
That's the reissue.
That's the reissue. So constantly updating, constantly crafting. So just a couple of ground rules. We are being videotaped, which means this is on the record. Please, when we get to the Q&A part, identify yourselves and tell us who you are, and don't say anything that you don't want to go up on our website. Welcome to you all, and really looking forward to the proceedings, and welcome to our 3 speakers. Fiona.
Happy birthday to Harriman, which is, looking good at 70. It's really been quite the period for anniversaries. In fact, our election, the US election, coincided essentially with the 99th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. I'm sure that didn't escape anybody sitting in this audience. And we've just had an election that's been described in quite revolutionary terms itself. And Bobo lives in, as he's just described it, the People's Republic of Brighton in England, which has just gone through its own upheaval. I'm thinking of calling the centre at Brookings the centre for the disunited states of the US and Europe at this particular point, because we seem to have, 25 years on from the dissolution of the Soviet Union, big questions about the future of the international order that was certainly established, or at least we thought was established after World War II, and really, as we also thought, was taking shape and consolidating in that period after 1991. Brexit, well, we know that Nigel Farage has just been here unexpectedly for Prime Minister May. She didn't know he was actually in New York, hanging out just down the street from all of us here, suggesting that he's going to be the creator of a new special relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States, declaring what's happened in the US as a new Brexit. And joking aside, it's easy to make a lot of jokes about some of these developments. We really are in a very serious situation. And Ted is sitting in a very unique position in Singapore, the home of Lee Kuan Yew, who really, I think, wrote the book about how to be a strongman ruler, but in a very specific setting. You know, looking out now at a world that, from the perspective of Southeast Asia, is looking increasingly questionable. So when we think of Russia in this context, Russia might, ironically, perhaps be more predictable when we look towards the future or not. And I think that's what we're really going to try to tease out tonight with Bobo and Ted and you in the audience about where we think Russia is headed as we move away from this anniversary of the 25 years since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. What are the drivers for Russian foreign policy? A lot of that has been, of course, the relationship with the United States in the last couple of years, particularly since Putin's return to the presidency for a third term in 2012. A lot of Russian foreign policy seems, on the surface, to have revolved around a very antagonistic relationship with the United States. And the big question for everyone now is, how much does leadership matter? How much will a change, a very unexpected change in direction in the United States and a president that a lot of people were not anticipating, open up the way potentially for a new relationship? And if it's not leadership and personalities that matter, then what are the drivers of Russian foreign policy that might actually prove to be an obstacle for what looks to be a great new romance, at least at the outset, between President-elect Trump and President for a very long time, Vladimir Putin. And then what about Russia's role as a great power? Referring back to Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew had quite a big ambition for what he wanted to do with Singapore, from a city-state to being a very significant regional power. Britain, the Brexit vote was partly motivated by people wanting to take their country back again and talking about a new golden age of the United Kingdom as a mercantilist, Bobo's cringing, power all over again. But we've got so many now prospective candidates for general elections in France and Germany who are talking about making their countries great again. The great slogans of the Trump campaign was America first, let's make the United States great again. Is it going to be enough room in the world for all these great powers and their great power statuses? And how fundamental is that preoccupation for Russia now about being a great power? It was certainly something that Yeltsin talked about in the 1990s, but that Putin has made something of a hallmark since 2000. And then with the two of you here, Asia. I don't know whether we're pivoting to Asia anymore in our new world either, but how will this play out over the longer term with China? We're of course asking here whether there might be some major shift in US policy toward China. Will we end up in a trade war? What does this mean for the future of the US-China relationship? How will Russia perceive this, and what will the view look like from Southeast Asia? Russia or Putin, just before the US election, made some statements about opening bases, again, naval bases in Vietnam and Cam Ranh Bay, also Cuba. How much are we likely to see the return of a global perspective on great power politics, and in line with the title of your book, Bobo, things we seem to be much more headed for disorder. And then if we can get our heads around all of this, what does this all mean for a new US administration? I think when Alex was conceiving of this, perhaps we didn't really know, what we were going to be contemplating, but this is an opportunity, perhaps tabula rasa, for us to come up with some ideas. So I hope you're all writing notes on a postcard some ideas that we can throw out there now to see how we can move forward. So if I turn first to, should we just go in order here, or Ted first, to my left, if you agree, and then we'll hear from Ted and Bobo, who will speak briefly from the podium, and then we'll engage all of you in a discussion. Thanks so much.
Cool. So as you can see, I'm cribbing some tables from an article published earlier this year. So what I want to talk about is how discourses of Russian national identity have changed in the past 25 years and what these implications have been for Russian foreign policy and Russian relations with the West, the United States, and the rest of the world. So the data for this is largely a discourse analysis of several thousand leadership speeches by Putin and Medvedev. And if there are other sources, I'll talk about them along the way. And I realize I only have 15 minutes, so this is going to be really quick without much detail, but I'm happy to go into more detail during the question and answer. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, as you can see from this table, the discursive terrain was dominated by two discourses that are evenly poised in 1991, 50-50, conservative and liberal, namely neo-Soviets, if you will, and those looking to the West as a model. But you can quickly see that the liberal discourse collapses very, very quickly. And instead, what it's replaced by is the centrist discourse that takes elements from both a neo-Soviet view of what Russia should be and from a Western view of what Russia should be. And if you want to smooth out these curves, you'd see this non-stop, sometimes halting, but not very halting, domination of the discursive terrain by the centrist discourse, which we can associate with Putin today, but also Medvedev and also Yeltsin. And the discourse that suffers the most is, of course, the liberal discourse, the 5% of the electorate, if you want to call it that, but also the conservative discourse, the neo-communist, neo-Soviet discourse suffers as well. And then one interesting blip is here in 2001, is after 9/11, when liberal discourse gets resuscitated by the conservative identification with Islamic terrorism against the United States after 9/11. I don't know whether we recall this or not, but communists and Zhirinovsky were making speeches in the Duma calling on Putin to cooperate or to ally with Islam against the United States. This was not a winning strategy politically in Russia, given Chechnya and views toward Islamic terrorism. They've kind of forgotten that blip, but it was an important 3 months before it was clear to the conservatives that they couldn't win on this. So this is just a snapshot over time. Where have we ended up? Well, we've ended up with this centrist domination of the discursive terrain, with the marginalization of liberals or identification with the West, and a pretty fair marginalization of the conservatives. But when I get to the end, I'll show you just how much of the elements of each of these discourses the centrist understanding of being Russia have co-opted. So it's not as if liberals and conservatives have lost, that is, a lot of their elements have become part of the centrist discourse, and I'll show you a couple that have disappeared. So now let me get to some word clouds. This word cloud is the result of a discourse analysis of Putin's public remarks from 2000 to 2008. And so the size denotes the numerical or the quantitative relative size of each of these elements in understanding what Russia is. So as you can see, neoliberal is very, very important. That is developing a market economy with free trade and the normal, accoutrement of a neoliberal economic project. Russia is developing. The Soviet experience is largely negative. However, Russian democracy need not feel itself as being inferior to the West, largely because it's a developing country on its way to becoming more democratic. Then we have the Medvedev interregnum, and we see a new dominant understanding of Russia, namely foreign standards. That is, Russia should be adopting the best practices of largely the West. So neoliberal remains very, very strong. The Soviet Union as being negative remains very, very strong still. And corrupt. Russia is a corrupt country, is a negative identification of Russia. Notice that it was absent from Putin's discourse in the first 8 years. And a regional leader, namely that Russia should become the natural center of gravity for the former Soviet space. And now, most recently, over the 2012 to 2016, this is Putin again, still neoliberal, still the Soviet Union negative largely. Democracy, though, is much better than the West. That is, that Russian democracy has a little to apologize for with respect to its development. Raw material appendage remains as a negative identity one's trying to avoid. Corruption has virtually disappeared as a negative identification of Russia. Two new identities which had not appeared before are imperial Russia as a positive model for Russia. Also multinational, that is, Russia is a Rossiyske государство with many nationalities. And also, again, most important, very, very importantly, is this Russia no longer needing to apologize for being inferior. I'm going to go through each of these, but first let me get to the last slide to show you where we are today. What's happened to these discourses. There we are. Okay, so as you can see, the only thing that isn't part of centrist discourse for the liberals is Western democracy and civil rights. This is the only thing left that hasn't been co-opted by the centrist discourse. Meanwhile, you go to the right, and the conservative discourse has been completely co-opted except for ethno-national Russia. That is, Russkost is not part of the predominant discourse yet in Russia. But as you can see, almost all the rest have already been accommodated as part of the center's understanding of what Russia is. Okay. So what's remained constant for 25 years? There's still an attachment to neoliberalism as being the preferred economic model, despite the fact that we know now in the last 18 months the state control of the economy has gone from 30% to 70%. Second, that Russia must avoid becoming a raw material appendage. Now, I'm glad Elizabeth Falconer is here because I probably learned raw material appendage from her. Namely, I mean, this actually calling yourself a raw material appendage in Russian discourse is quite resonant and poignant because this is what Soviets would accuse the US and the West and the imperialists of making colonial countries, raw material appendages of the West. So to have the Russia today understood as a raw material appendage is quite pejorative, and yet Russian leaders still think of themselves as a raw material appendage that needs to be changed. We cannot go on any longer as a raw material appendage. The Soviet Union remains negative in a political and economic sense. That is, I mean, there's no glorification of gulags and the kind of political rule or the economic model. However, the Soviet past, its culture, its relations among nationalities, its high mass culture, its infrastructure and so forth are still positively evaluated. In addition, across these 25 years, it's understood that Russia is just developing. It's a developing country. It's not a finished modern project. And this is kind of a two-edged sword. On the one hand, it's very unusual for state leaders anywhere to talk about their countries as developing and as being behind other countries, especially if you think of yourself as a great power. But this also serves as an opportunity to excuse flaws and deficiencies, especially democratic and civil society flaws and deficiency. So you can imagine many, many times when this element of discourse comes up that Russia is just developing, it's often in the context of pleading with Western critics to give Russia a break. I mean, you've been making democracy for 200-odd years. We've only been doing it for 25. We're far more advanced than you ever were at 25 years after your birth as a democracy. So you should, be less, be more accepting, more generous in your evaluation of us. And last, a constant over these 25 years has been Russia as a regional leader. I think one thing that we forget is that when the Soviet Union collapsed, the entire infrastructure remained. So all the pipelines, electricity grids, highways, economic links remained. So consequently, from the Russian perspective, they often use the word natural, like it's, естественно, we must build, maintain our economic ties. I mean, from Moscow's perspective, Russia is the natural regional leader, right? Just from a material point of view, because of the directions in which transportation, electricity, and other routes go. I mean, I remember, just as recent as 10 years ago, it was still, much more efficient to fly from Azerbaijan to Moscow to go to Astrakhan than to fly between Azerbaijan and Astrakhan directly, since you could not fly to Astrakhan directly. So there's still a lot of these imperial routes, these imperial transportation and infrastructural routes that still exist. But this idea of being a regional leader has grown much more comprehensive because now it's understood culturally and spiritually as well. Culturally in the sense that, well, we were all part of the Soviet Union, so the ruling elites in all these countries, except for the Baltic, of course, the ruling elites in all these countries are just as Soviet as we are. And they're just like us. There's a we identification with leaders in Central Asia, Armenia, and so forth and so on. That also makes Russia the natural center, the natural regional leader. And last, and most recently, are a revival in the last 3-4 years of an ethno-national spiritual orthodox sense of leadership, right? That Russia is the older brother for Ukraine and Belarus, not to mention southeastern Europe. So all these are constants over time. And the regional leadership trope, if you will, has been more kind of deeply and comprehensively articulated in recent years. So those are like 6 constants. But there are also 3 elements of Russian identity that have, I don't want to say more or less disappeared, but they've become far, far less salient. First is reliance on foreign standards. So while this peaked under Medvedev, it virtually disappeared under Putin. This is very, very important because it means that Russia no longer understands itself as measuring itself and its development and its trajectory against other countries or other civilizations or other cultures. This is extremely important. In fact, some of you in this room will be very, very happy to know that a year ago Putin declared that social science citation indexes would no longer be used to evaluate Russian professors for tenure, right? That's a Western imposition upon Russian academics to continue to use publishing in SSCI journals as part of a way of evaluating productivity. I mean, it has huge practical implications for things like Skolkovo, of course, right, for how you evaluate research. The other element that has disappeared most dramatically in the last few years is corruption. I mean, under Putin I and under Medvedev, Russia as a corrupt country was very salient, and it was something against which one must struggle. Under Putin, this has largely disappeared. And I can say parenthetically, in another project that works on Chinese national identity, we've had the exact opposite. So in a discourse analysis of China in 2010, China as corrupt was a huge component of mass understandings of Chinese national identity. But among the leadership, it was treated as something, a problem, but something that could be easily overcome. But now we see 4 years later that mass discourse of understanding China as corrupt, and negatively so, is now infusing the leadership's policies, whereas in Russia it dropped out. And third, and related to the foreign standards, is that throughout the first 20 years of Russian statehood, new Russian statehood, identification with Europe was very, very salient. Now that has disappeared dramatically from elite discourse about Russia as being European or part of European civilization. Now, parenthetic, I say I won't present the results here, but I said I would indicate if I have other sources. When you look at mass popular sources like novels and movies, this European identification of Russia remains. So it's pretty clear to me that the dissociation with Europe is an elite project that is meant to wean Russians off their understanding. But in addition, I mean, I've looked at a collection of 2015 high school history textbooks, and there Russia is 100% European. So they haven't managed to rewrite history yet to disassociate Russia from Europe. It's very difficult, right? I mean, if Russia is a great power, where is it a great power? Well, it's a European great power. If Russia has a great civilization, what kind of civilization is it? It's a European civilization. Their contributions to literature and art and music and opera and dance and so forth are all European contributions. So it's going to be a very, very difficult discourse to propagate from an official level. Last, and definitely not least, are two emergent identities that have appeared under Putin in the last 4 years. The first is that Imperial Russia is understood positively. Now, if you had asked me at the collapse of the Soviet Union, which I guess some people did ask me at the collapse of the Soviet Union, what would be some identities that Russia would glom onto in order to understand itself? I would have said Imperial Russia, right? And I said Imperial Russia for many, many years, but it never appeared. Now it's appearing, right? And it's interesting because some of the most popular texts in Russia, like Akunin's novels, are full of Imperial Russia and a very, very highly valorized view of Imperial Russia, the Golden Age. I mean, you can read an Akunin novel from where he depicts late 19th, early 20th century, and you think Russia was a land of milk and honey, wine and roses, right? And there's no oppression, there's no class conflict, there's no poverty, no impoverishment, no peasantry, nothing. It's just this beautiful bourgeois experience. So it's quite notable that Imperial Russia is now positively evaluated in the identity discourse. And last is, how to put this, Russia is no longer inferior because it has its own unique civilization that isn't parasitic upon Western understandings of civilization or culture or political order. In fact, I noticed downstairs, I think you have John Mearsheimer coming to town to talk about Clash of Civilizations. Well, what was like one of the single most popular books in Russia in the 1990s? Clash of Civilizations. Why? Well, because Huntington called them a civilization. Right? This was fabulous. I mean, they had no idea they were a civilization, but Huntington said it was true. So who's to argue? So let me close. I've taken my 15 minutes for sure. But what are the implications of this? In a certain sense, Russia has responded to globalization against globalization 10, 15 years before Brexit and the United States and Eastern Europe have. When you think about this alliance of conservatives that is emerging in the world, well, Putin got there first, right? I mean, he's been trying to protect Russia from the influences of globalization for a long, long time. On dozens of different indicators, Russia is one of the least globalized countries for its level of economic development of any country in the world. And I think I'll conclude by saying that Russia is uniquely placed to continue materially supporting this project. I mean, to the extent that they can rely upon almost endless reserves of hydrocarbon exports, they can finance this project. I mean, there's no reason not to be bullish, unfortunately, perhaps, on Russia's Putinist future. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Well, thanks very much for having me here. It's really a great honor to come back to Harriman, I think 12 years after I was last here. Alex and Fiona have set us some pretty big questions, and you almost feel that you could talk about each of them for 20 minutes, but I will try and refrain from that. The first question I want to look at is what has happened to Russia and Russian foreign policy over the last 25 years. If you like, from a Western perspective, how did we get from the sunny uplands of 1992 to the dark depths of today? And I think the best way to look at this is in terms of two periods. a period of foreign policy retrenchment in the 1990s, and then the Putin era, which has seen the vigorous reassertion of Russian geopolitical interests and rights, in inverted commas. So if we start off with the retrenchment, I think to understand where Russian foreign policy is today, we need to recall the extraordinary challenges Russia faced in the 1990s. And I would identify those challenges as four. The first is post-imperial adjustment. Now, part of the problem of post-imperial adjustment for Russia in the 1990s was material. Because Russia was so conflated with the Soviet Union, it felt to many that Russia had lost 30% of its territory, half its population, and much of its economic base. So, to put it crudely, it fell from hero to zero, from the second superpower to an object of derision and pity. And that's a really tough challenge to meet. The second problem, the second challenge, is what I'd call post-communist adjustment. The sheer scale of the problems that the Russian public faced, that Russian leaders faced, was completely shocking to both state and society. No one was ready for the vast changes that were necessary. No one was ready, anticipated the extraordinary impact on society. And the problem with this complete surprise, if you like, was that liberal democracy became quickly discredited and Western norms and values were blamed for Russia's troubles. And in fact, TED's statistics, TED's tables show that. Third challenge, post-Cold War adjustment. From the outset, from 1991-92, there were excessive expectations on all sides. The Russian elite anticipated much greater assistance from the West, and more importantly, perhaps, greater gratitude from West. And it anticipated also that Russia, despite its problems, would somehow remain a great power, as it were, by divine right. Even Kozyrev, I remember, saying Russia was, is, and will always be a great power, and he also said that Russia was doomed to be a great power. So there you go, a liberal foreign minister, even he thought that Russia deserved this special status despite all the problems it had. And when this did not happen, the Russian elite felt betrayed. It felt betrayed not just by the fact of NATO enlargement, but just generally in a sort of a more generalized sense. Now, Western leaders also had ridiculous expectations. They believed that Russia would become steadily integrated into Western institutions. That Russia, sure, there might be a couple of sort of roadblocks here and there, but that Russia would naturally absorb Western norms and values because they were so right, so virtuous. And they made the big mistake, and Fiona's written about this, of thinking that of confusing Russian weakness for Russian compliance. The fact that the Yeltsin administration was in no position to openly defy the West was treated as, oh yes, they're on board with our agenda. So a complete lack of realism. And then the fourth challenge, again Ted's referred to this, globalization. The speed of the Soviet demise meant that Russian leaders were ill-prepared to adapt to the unprecedented pace of global change, and economic globalization in particular. So, by the end of the 1990s, Russia and Russian foreign policy is in a very bad place. Domestic political situation is corrosive. The economy, although starting to recover, is pretty bad. The sense of insecurity and national humiliation is all pervasive, and Russia appears to be in full geopolitical retreat. So when we think about that nadir from a Russian perspective, The reassertion of Russian foreign policy under Putin has been extraordinary. Today, Russia is an infinitely more confident actor, and Western indifference and contempt for Russia has been replaced by Western fear and even panic. So how did this transformation occur? Well, the most important variable for me is the decade of rapid economic growth following the 1998 financial crash. This wasn't just important materially, but also because it gave Putin, the Kremlin, the Russian elite, the self-confidence to pursue a more assertive foreign policy. Then, of course, the arrival and rise and consolidation of Putin has been decisive. He has driven a foreign policy approach that's firmly rooted in geopolitics and conservative conceptions of Russian identity. Crucially, he sees Russian engagement with the West not as an inherent good, but as merely one of many tools to make Russia great. Third variable, the United States overstretch, post 9/11, has contributed substantially to the resurgence of Russian foreign policy. I'm not only talking here about the failed or failing operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, which have undermined the US's international authority, but I'm also talking about the hesitation of Western policymakers over Georgia in 2008 and Syria since 2011, the mismanagement of the Libyan crisis, and it's reinforced these negative perceptions and created a real sense of optimism in the Kremlin that, you know what, we can take these guys, we can defy these guys. But the real killer is the fourth variable, which is the global financial crisis. Because this didn't just merely devastate Western economies, it devastated the whole idea about the innate superiority of liberal democratic norms, values, and institutions. And the narrative of a dominant West was destroyed, again fueling Moscow's sense of optimism and opportunism. But you've also got to have alternatives. If you can't go the West, where do you go? What are the alternatives to the West? Now, not for a moment am I suggesting that Russia is trying to follow a China model, but the very fact of the rise of China has helped to discredit the West. China's emergence as an economic and increasingly political powerhouse and the steady development of the Sino-Russian relationship over the last quarter of a century has given real oomph to Russian foreign policy. And I have to say that the arrival of Xi Jinping in 2012 has been a real bonus for Moscow. But when you look at Russia and Russian foreign policy, you should never forget about grievances. And there have been plenty. But I want to pick out 3 grievances that have really pushed Russian foreign policy to where it is today. The first is the 2004 Orange Revolution. The second are the anti-Putin protests of 2011 and 12. And the third, of course, is the Maidan Revolution and the overthrow of Yanukovych. The collective impact of these events has been to reinforce already strong feelings of grievance and regime insecurity. But perhaps more importantly, the belief that there's no such thing as international morality, international rules. Ultimately, right belongs to the strongest. If you want to assert your rights, well, you've just got to rely on yourself. You can't rely on this sort of woolly international norms. That's nice to sort of, for a little bit of veneer. But it's not really fundamentally what the world is about. Question number 2, what are the drivers of Russian foreign policy? I mean, from this review of the last 25 years, I think we can pick out a few. In an ultra-personalized political system, individuals are key, and Fiona's written a lot about this. Putin's personality has a decisive impact on key areas of foreign policy making. And I would particularly point out relations with the United States, relations with China, policies towards Ukraine, and more generally, the promotion of Russia as an indispensable global great power. But individuals are not just products of their personal foibles or even professional background. They reflect a larger strategic and political culture. And Putin's realpolitik view of international relations in fact reflects a dominant paradigm, I would argue, of the Soviet and Tsarist eras, and leads him naturally to emphasize things like hard security and geopolitics. And indeed, history and geography are fundamental to Putin's notions of great powerness and indispensability. Now, it's clear that political and economic conditions are crucial, because the problem that Yeltsin had was, how can you build a viable Russian foreign policy on the basis of a collapsing economy? Just impossible. Whereas Putin, admittedly, the Russian economy is in a bit of difficulty now, but Putin benefited from years and years of growth, well over a decade of growth. So, in a sense, he not only built political capital, but he also he developed the self-confidence to say that Russia can do it, I can do it. Now, I think identity matters a lot, but we also need to remember that identity is fluid and ubiquitous, and that indeed that Putin has used lots of different identities to describe Russia. What is clear is that he won't be bound by any single identity, as Ted was pointing out, in fact. And if Russia does have one permanent identity, I would say that it's the identity of being all-transcending. We cannot be pigeonholed. We're neither European nor Asian. We're all those things. And the implication is, you know what? We're a bit better. Interests are important. Of course they are. But we need to be careful that, to avoid this sort of blather about permanent national interests. Permanent national interests, the concept has no meaning except in the most vague motherhood sense of national security, world peace, that sort of stuff. Now, the result of all these sort of drivers is that for the past 25 years, Russian foreign policy actually has been more reactive and ad hoc than strategic. Because I would argue that even today, Putin pursues a predominantly tactical approach to foreign policy, even while he retains a general vision or wish list. In these circumstances, events are absolutely crucial. Indeed, I would argue that events are the single most important driver of Moscow's approach to the world. Third question. Fiona, you asked, how fundamental is the preoccupation with multipolarity and great power? How do they really believe this, in a sense? I think they do. But multipolarity is a different issue. Because Putin believes in a multipolar world, not because he thinks multipolar is an essentially better system. It's because he realizes that a multipolar world is the best way of promoting Russia, the real goal, which is Russia as a global great power, at once independent and indispensable. Equally, when Putin speaks of a new global order, he doesn't really mean new order, he actually means old order. And I think the old order that he imagines is a kind of hybrid. A hybrid between a concert of great powers, on the one hand, so the great powers sort of set the rules of the game, but also traditional strategic balancing as well. But both of these are 19th century concepts. There's nothing 21st century about them in their conceptual origins. Equally, you often hear multipolarity and multilateralism used kind of interchangeably. But we should remember that these are two very different concepts. Multipolarity is an exclusivist concept. It's basically about the great powers decide, the smaller countries do as they're told, and the international institutions supply the veneer of legitimacy. This regular resort to the notion of international law. Now, Multilateralism, however, is a much more democratic, inclusive concept. Now, Putin doesn't want that. He wants power to rest among a few great powers. He's a real 19th century traditionalist in that sense. And his conception is tripolar. So when he says multipolar, it's just about multipolar. He envisages the United States still, China coming up quickly on the rails, but also Russia. And indeed, Russia would be the great swing power between the United States and China, holding the geopolitical balance, also being the bridge between East and West. And in this way, it would be able to achieve an independent and strategically flexible foreign policy. Now, I know I'm running out of time, but I'll just say some words about the pivot to Asia, because I suppose that's why I'm here. We should say that there's nothing new about Moscow's turn to the east. In the 1990s, Yeltsin tried to develop a geographically balanced foreign policy. But what is different, obviously, under Putin is that there's a lot more energy and dynamism being pushed in behind the turn to the east. However, there are real questions, in my view, about the sincerity of Moscow's commitment to the east, and also real questions about the effectiveness of his approach. First, I think it's less about a turn to the east than a turn away from the west. It's about a rebalancing of Russian foreign policy. And what's interesting is that events essentially extraneous to Asia, or largely extraneous to Asia, global financial crisis, end of the US reset, anti-Putin protests, Maidan revolution, have been the principal drivers of Moscow's engagement with Asia. Even then, a fundamental reorientation of Russian policy towards Asia has not happened. Putin's worldview remains overwhelmingly Western-centric. Not pro-Western, obviously, but it's the West that occupies his mind, first and foremost. The United States represents a strategic reference point, and economic and cultural ties with Europe are much, much closer than with Asia. I think also we need to make a critical distinction between Russia having an Asia policy and Russia having a China first policy in Asia. Because Russia is not interested in China because it happens to be Asian. It couldn't care less whether it was Asian. What matters about China is it is the next global superpower. That's really what counts. And therefore, if you're thinking globally, in traditional Russian global geopolitics, global grand design, you need to take account of China. But China is not Asia. It may be part of Asia, but it's not the same as Asia. And it's crucial to remember this. And unsurprisingly, in these circumstances, Russia's footprint in Asia is extremely shallow, with the obvious exception of the relationship with China. And indeed, the more Moscow focuses on its relationship with Beijing, the fewer chances it has of developing a genuinely Asian policy. Now, the Sino-Russian partnership arguably is the greatest success of Putin's foreign policy. Yet I disagree with a lot of people who argue that it's an authoritarian entente, much less an alliance. I wrote a book in 2008 called Axis of Convenience, and I think it remains a relationship of strategic convenience. There are major differences in Russian and Chinese views of the world, in their visions of the multipolar order, and even in more specific areas like relations with the United States. And there's a big question, of course, is whether an improvement in US-Russia relations could lead to changes in Moscow's approach towards China. Fiona, you raised this. I think for the time being this is unlikely, because Putin will be cautious in his dealings with Trump, both because I think the Russians see Trump as a pretty mercurial and unstable character, simply unknown quantity. I mean, I think Trump might be an unknown quantity to Trump, but we'll see. But also mainly because I think they doubt, perhaps with good cause, that Trump will be able to take Congress with him in a rapprochement with China. So they don't want to gamble, especially since China, which increasingly dominates the relationship with Russia, has the potential to cause serious damage to Russian interests in particularly Central Asia. So why run the risk? Why not rely on the sort of the sure thing, relatively speaking? Now, in the end, a successful turn to the east for Russia will only be possible when Moscow treats Asia, engagement with Asia as valuable in itself and not merely as a component of Russian grand strategic design. Finally, implications for the West going forward and for the US administration? Well, although Moscow has welcomed the victory of Donald Trump, I think it would be unwise to expect any significant changes to Russian foreign policy in the short to medium term. I think Putin will adopt a wait-and-see approach to Washington, and it will expect Washington to initiate any concessions, any moves. And if Putin is going to make any concessions, he will do so on a strictly tactical and transactional basis. There's going to be no retreat from the core goals of Russian foreign policy, which are non-interference in our domestic affairs, a sphere of influence in our neighborhood, and respect for us as a global power. Now, Putin will hope, but not necessarily expect, that Washington will now abandon Ukraine, maybe work with Moscow in Syria. He'd welcome the end to the Obama rebalance towards Asia. He'd hope for the US-India relationship to go sour again. But on the transatlantic alliance, he may judge that, you know what? I'll leave it to Donald to wreck it all by himself. So I'm actually not going to interfere here. You know, why fix it if it's going to break anyway? So I think it's really unrealistic to expect a US-Russia grand bargain, although there is some potential for cooperation in individual areas. I wonder whether ExxonMobil will get going again in the Arctic in the not-too-distant future. But we should remember that the US serves also a very useful purpose as первый враг, as the first enemy for the Putin regime. And yeah, it's kind of nice to have that card to play from time to time. I think potential problem areas are relations with China, the future of the Iranian nuclear deal. I'd be fascinated to see if John Bolton becomes sort of Secretary of State. And security engagement with Europe if Putin overpresses. I think, we were talking about this just before we came down, the personal dynamic between Trump and Putin will be crucial. I'll just give you a little example. The personal dynamic between Putin and Turkish leader Erdogan was crucial in expanding the Russian-Turkish relationship, but it also aggravated a crisis when things went wrong. So the personal factor can be really useful for a relationship, but it can have a negative multiplier effect when things go badly. So this is something we need to work for when we have two pretty mercurial characters. On advice to the Trump administration, not that they would ever listen to anything I would ever say, the biggest mistake that Trump could make with Putin is to imagine that Moscow is so desperate for a deal, for a better relationship with the United States, that Putin would be willing to make significant compromises to achieve a deal. That's not going to happen. The main reason is that Putin, and indeed, I would say right across the Russian political elite, they think they hold the whip hand. They think they hold the initiative, not just in the Middle East, but also in relation to China and obviously in Europe as well. Now, if the West wants to be able to engage with Putin on any sort of effective level, it'll have to put its own house in order. And this means doing much more, in a sense, worrying much less about what happens in Russia and other parts of the world, but doing much more to restore the credibility of Western-led norms, institutions, and economies. Because until this happens, Western governments will be in no position to negotiate with Putin, much less put any meaningful pressure on him. I'll leave it there. Sorry to run so late.
That was extremely rich. We're going to have a mic here to bring around for the audience. But having heard Bobo answer all of the exam questions, actually, I was ticking them off. That was pretty impressive. Would he do all right at Harriman? Okay, perfect. I was wondering if I could actually turn to Ted, first of all, to get perhaps a little bit of commentary and insight onto that. I mean, I think one of the important points that Bobo flagged was that Russia's Asia policy is really a China policy. Now, the United States itself has tried to work very hard to make sure that its Asia policy is not a China policy, but China does tend to dominate. And you're, of course, sitting in a rather important location in Asia. And I mean, how does Russia really seem from the perspective of Singapore? I mean, one thing to flag is on December 15th, Putin will visit Japan. And I do think that Putin is looking to have a couple more cards to play in the region, and capitalizing on a moment where Japan feels extraordinarily vulnerable, especially after our presidential election, in which there's big questions about the future of the US alliance system, not just with NATO, but the sanctity of the guarantees of security that have been given to Japan, Vietnam, and Korea in the Asia Pacific by the United States. And of course, there is some leverage there with Japan of the territorial dispute, which has been going on since World War II, the complete absence of a peace treaty for 71 years there, 1 year older than Harriman. But I don't think the relationship with Japan is going to become that pivotal for the relationships overall in Asia. So how does it look, Ted?
I guess I have, three responses. First, I'd like to back up and kind of correct perhaps a misimpression from the audience that Bobo and I think that Russia is actually succeeding at what they're doing. Maybe Bobo thinks they are. I think they're not. No. And the reason is because we haven't talked about economics at all here. Right. The Russian economy is exactly where it was in the 1990s in terms of developing value-added products for export and manufacturing. I mean, the trillions of dollars that Russia earned in the 2000s to 2015 have been completely wasted in terms of economic transformation. I mean, Medvedev and Putin continually complain about this, despite adopting or pursuing policies and strategies that reproduce it. Non-military, non-raw material exports in the Russian export portfolio are less than 5% of the total. And many of these are tied goods, so like legacy goods, like sending railway wagons to countries in the former Soviet Union that still use Russian rolling stock, and nuclear reactors. So the sustainability of being a global great power is very, very questionable. In fact, I was kind of shocked that Bob even used the word global great power, because Russians never call themselves a global great power ever that I've seen. At most, great power, and almost all of their activities are involved in restoring Russian domination or hegemony within the region, not reaching beyond. As far as Syria is concerned, when people ask me, what motivated Putin to go to war in Syria? The first thing that came to my mind was testing weapon systems. I mean, he wants to test combined arms operations. It's a very cynical way of engaging in like real warfare when no one's shooting back at you to see whether or not you can actually coordinate the Navy, Air Force, ground forces, and so forth, communication. In fact, he himself has said, I don't think he thought he was being cynical, he himself said, what could be a better place to train than Syria? Yeah. So I don't think of it as a global project at all. Now, in terms of the China-Russia relationship, again, maybe I'll be a little bit flip, but I often think of Russia as China's Austria-Hungary before World War I. That is, they have an ally who's far more aggressively anti-US and anti-Western than China is. And China's the reason why we have no alliance between China and Russia, even though Russia is constantly clamoring for it, is because China doesn't want to be sucked into any conflict between the U.S. and Russia.
Yeah, absolutely.
So China understands Russia is irresponsible. I mean, they got no support on Crimea, no support on Donbass, no support on Syria, silence at Shanghai Cooperation Organization meetings and so forth. I mean, they've gotten no support from China whatsoever. So China doesn't want to be pushed into a premature military conflict with the United States. In terms of the region itself, I mean Russia is understood as trivial and irrelevant in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and so forth, except for one thing: weapons. Right? I mean, it's a good source of cheaper weapons, cheaper conventional weapons, and some civilian nuclear technology. So I guess I think that Putin is. I guess I agree with Obama that you're in the long game and Putin is losing. And the U.S. is often compelled to act when, in fact, doing nothing is the better strategy, or doing as little as possible and just waiting. And in fact, I think China's made this mistake in the South China Sea. I mean, when I arrived in Singapore in 2012, relations between the U.S. and China were quite good, and relations between China and Southeast Asian countries were very good. Exactly. And then they started making territorial claims. I mean, some people claim this is because there's some quirk in the law of the sea treaty that required China to actually explicitly name territorial claims at some date certain before some expiration of some part of the treaty. But regardless, they've played it very, very poorly, and they've basically engaged in the only strategy that gets the U.S. back into the game. I mean, I advise Chinese to just wait. I mean, your grand strategy should be doing nothing for 10 or 20 years. The U.S. will disappear. The U.S. will go home. There is no reason to provoke. I mean, what could be more unifying for the U.S. polity than a new Cold War against China? I mean, what could get divisions in Washington overcome other than that? So don't overestimate the success of Russian strategy. Realize that China considers Russia to be an annoyance in terms of strategic relations with the United States, and last, Russia is irrelevant to the region.
Well, thanks, Ted. I mean, I guess, one of Putin's views is, in the long run, we're all dead, although he seems to be also quite keen on hanging around for the long run. But I do think that, well, we'll see, won't we? What Bobo was saying about stepping back and waiting to see how things play out in this next year, as you were saying about driven out by events, not just in the United States, but also in Europe, could really change Russia's fortunes if they're looking at everything. Success as being relative. The failure of others floats Russia's boat a little bit, rather than the overwhelming success. Because we have elections in, as we've said before, France and Germany and the Netherlands, which could be extremely consequential. We have the difficulties of the United States now working out what appears to be a completely whole new approach to foreign policy that's on very different premise from where it's been in the last 25 years for sure. And the United States, obviously, that's going to have to deal with its own divisions. And I do think that your last point about the West getting its own house in order, this is something that's really resonated in Europe as well. Wolfgang Schäuble, the finance minister of Germany, has made this comment quite frequently. People have asked him, how do we deal with Russia? He said, by getting our own economy in order. Because for economics, as you've pointed out, Russia has a very weak economic profile. It can mobilize resources very effectively over the longer term. But it was the role of Western economies, of European economies, Germany and others, and the United States, that was really instrumental in setting the tone. And we'll have to see, of course, where the Chinese economy goes as well. Certainly lots of problems there too that could unfold. So I do think we actually have a momentous year ahead of us in 2017. The 100th anniversary also of the Bolshevik Revolution, and whether Putin will be able to get himself through that rather scary anniversary, and on to whatever the next step is for the Russian system. I want to start bringing others in, and then we can come back to some of these points. Yes, sir. Yes, please, if you can speak into the mic for the purposes of the tape, and say who you are as well, please.
The Arctic was mentioned once. I don't know if any of you think that Russian aspirations in that region comes into this in any kind of substantive manner. Could you address that, please?
Yes, and so could you just say who you are?
I'm Bob Rees, author who writes about the Arctic.
Perfect, excellent. So a question about the Arctic. Does anybody else have a related question? Anybody else want to go towards the Arctic? No, let's take your question as well. Thank you. Yep. That's all right, but we can take that.
Well, I'm thinking about the commitment by President-elect Trump to cancel the support for the so-called moderate opposition in Syria. Because it seems to me that we should have a little bit of humility in this case. It's clear that we have not sorted out the moderate rebels from al-Nusra. That's not, something that we can deny. And so perhaps, I think there's a little humility here. I don't think the people, frankly, I think a lot of people were surprised by Trump's victory. That's obvious. Part of the thing he was saying was that Hillary's no-fly zone in Syria would cause World War III with Russia. So people seem to have internalized in terms of this country that the regime change policies of the past 15 years were not good. So I would say this is a first step in cooperation with Russia, and I would like to hear more about what positive cooperation with Russia and China we could have.
In Syria.
More broadly, you mean, right? Yeah, I mean, not just in
broadly.
Syria, but Syria as an example.
okay.
Yeah.
I'm hearing a lot of criticism,
Yep.
which is, certainly your prerogative, but I see a huge opportunity.
Right, that's a very good question. Let's take one more. We'll have a trifecta of questions. Yes, sir.
Charles Meekins, a master's student at the Harriman Institute. Sorry, I just wanted to piggyback on that and ask in particular about the issue of nuclear negotiation and proliferation. It seems like Russian foreign policy is very entrenched in many respects, but is there room for sort of bilateral grand bargain on this one issue, given its outsized importance?
And Philip, did you have a question? Yeah. No. We'll take one more because I'm a bit mindful of the time here as well.
Sorry.
Yeah. I think we can pull all of these together.
Yeah.
Well, I was just struck by the what you might call a disconnect. It seems between the rhetoric that comes out of Russia that you've cataloged, that Professor Hopf has cataloged, and the feeling that you get if you talk to people there that they seem to be feeling extremely isolated and defensive. And there's a lot of rhetoric, it seems to me, about this isn't the West versus Russia, this is the West versus the rest, and Russia is the standard bearer, standing up to the hypocrisy and decadence of a declining West. So I'd like your take, I think, on the disconnect between, say, the rhetoric that we hear, the more confident rhetoric, and perhaps whether that it masks an underlying weakness in not in economics so much as in feeling of position.
Great. Those are great questions.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, let's. One more. Yes, please. I'm sorry.
That also plays off on the U.S. Same thing. Why do we fight about women's issues and other? Because we don't know what else to do. So are we masking as well? And everybody's got to settle back. So we're not doing as well as we like either. So and we don't really have solutions for it.
Right. So pretty much picking up on what was just said. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah, I think actually we can pull all these together.
What might Putin think about the possible weakening of Europe post-Brexit? How does he figure this into his plans? And how does he see Britain, self-announced world power to be, or at least the voice of the North Sea herring fisheries?
Voice of the North Sea. Iceland might disagree with that one, but anyway, yeah. Okay, anybody else want to come in? Well, let's go back. And, we'll start at the top with the Arctic. I mean, these are all great questions. I do think we actually can pull them all together.
Yeah, good.
So,
Shall we go?
How about them and,
All right. The thing about the Arctic is that it's down the list of live issues because there's so much else going on. So although I think there are some real potential tensions between environmental and development objectives, between Russia and China and the United States in the Arctic, I feel that in a way it's been pushed down the list of priorities because there's Syria, there's Europe, there's China and Russia and South China Sea and Northeast Asia and Iran. And so it's not that people aren't thinking about it. Indeed, I'm going to Tromsø to Arctic Frontiers Conference to do a second year in a row on, first time last year they had a Russia panel. So they are starting to think about it. But the fact that even the Norwegians only put it on the agenda the first time last year suggests that it is sort of some way down the list. So, but I do see some real problems, but I just see other things taking center stage first. On Syria, you sort of, and where we might work with Russia and China, and well, let's say Russia on Syria, because the Chinese, they're not that interested, to be frank, in Syria. They just they've got so many other more urgent priorities. The problem with Russia, working with Russia, is that they have different objectives to us. Now, I'm perhaps a little less cynical than Ted on the weapons testing. I actually think that Russia sees Syria as a wonderful opportunity to show that it is actually a global power. Because what is the most high-profile issue in the world today? I mean, maybe not in the United States, but in many, many other countries, it is Syria. So if you can show your stuff in Syria, then you show that you can really play the part of a global actor. But the problem is, I think Russia wants different things to us. And so the question is, how do we reconcile contrasting objectives? Because I think the Russian main objective is projecting geopolitical power, both regionally but also globally. I think our objective in the West is damage control, frankly. And I just don't see how that's necessarily going to work. It might work in specific tactical circumstances, like deconfliction arrangements. But I suspect that also maybe the best way it works, and this is a really cynical perspective perhaps, is that the war is over. So in a way the West is presented with a fait accompli. But then the Russians will ask, okay, Syria's broken now. Assad has won the war. Who's going to rebuild the country? So he's going to ask for Western money here. And I just can't see Donald Trump, or indeed any other European leader, investing lots of money in Syria's reconstruction. On nuclear disarmament, many, many issues with nuclear disarmament, but one is the obvious mistrust between Washington and Moscow. But there's also an outlier problem, which is China. The Russians, even at the height of the START agreement, when everything seemed to be going well, said this would be the last round of negotiations they would do unless the Chinese were brought in. In other words, it shows that they take the China threat, that the China threat hasn't gone altogether. That they still see China as a potential threat. Not immediately, not in the same way that the United States is. It's not a clear and present danger. But the Russians will not go into further rounds of negotiations unless the Chinese are brought in. Now, the Chinese are saying, no way are we going to do this. So that is a fundamental problem with nuclear disarmament. The Russian people feeling isolated? Yes, I think they do feel sensitive. I think, but part of it is this sort of осажденная крепость, kind of besieged fortress mentality, or what I call the sort of the Millwall football fans mentality, which is everyone hates us and we don't care. In a sense, we get strength out of it. So on the one hand, they feel sort of like a little bit vulnerable, but on the other hand, they almost take pride in, we can tough it out. And finally, Putin's attitude towards weakening of Europe. Well, I think Putin has a kind of different vision. He doesn't really want Europe to be weakened so much as the EU's law-based, institutionalized vision of Europe to be utterly annihilated. So I think what Putin wants is, in a sense, a return to European civilization, where to feel European is to be European. You don't have to sort of, meet certain sort of technical requirements. And the other thing I think Putin wants is he wants to go back to a kind of concert of Europe where the continental troika, Russia, Germany, France, the big players. Where's the UK in all this? Nowhere. Why? Because the UK is the United States lackey. That's the way it's viewed from the Kremlin. The UK is... I remember when Tony Blair suggested in 2004 to Putin that he might sort of, be a link between Bush and the Kremlin, and Putin told him where to go. You're an insignificant has-been, especially now that you're about to leave Europe. So no, they don't take the UK seriously.
You're cursing some British angst in the audience here.
I guess I'll pick up from where Bobo left off.
At that particular point?
Yeah. Well, indeed, yes, because I think it relates to one of Bobo's comments before about how Russia thinks of itself as having a transcendent identity. I mean, there's a lot of talk in the last 3 or 4 years, again, that Russia's beyond Europe. It transcends Europe, and in some cases, Russia is the true Europe.
Yes.
Because it has the spiritual and cultural values that have been uncontaminated by contact with the United States and domination by the United States. So Russia is sometimes, particularly in intellectual circles, not so much among policymakers, but among intellectual circles, understood and asserted to be the true, authentic, genuine Europe, as opposed to the deracinated Europeans who have been corrupted by the United States. On this, on Syria, to me this is very interesting because, Russia, even under Yeltsin, tried to get the U.S. interested in a global anti-terrorist alliance. And the U.S. kind of treated this unseriously as being, well, they're just trying to, get help in Chechnya. And the U.S. didn't trust Russia's intelligence sharing of contacts between Chechen rebels in the Gulf and Saudi Arabia, perhaps to the U.S. peril. That little spike I showed you in 2011 with the center and the liberals coming together after 9/11, a lot of this had to do with Russia understanding itself once again as being in the global war on terror with the United States. So indeed, that was a great expectation, and this helps feed this great power identity, or the global great power identity that Bubba was talking about, but on only 3 issues: terrorism, nonproliferation, and nuclear arms control. So those are the three areas where Russia understands itself as being equal to the U.S. And that we should be involved with the United States on these 3 issues. And of course, this is all put paid in the fall of 2001 when Bush unilaterally abrogated the ABM treaty and went off on his war in Iraq. So there's an opportunity that was passed. And last, on just a footnote on the Arctic, again from the perspective of China, one of Russia's aims in the Arctic is to take advantage of global warming and open year-round shipping, and this is rendered almost 100% moot by the One Belt, One Road initiative of China, where in fact it will be more efficient just to go overland on rail. And it actually also raises the conflict of interest in Central Asia, because as you know, China is far more interested in building rail routes through Central Asia and Iran and Iraq and Turkey than it is through Russia proper.
That's right. Just a quick point on the Arctic. The Chinese regard the Arctic, as you know, as global commons, whereas the Russians take a highly proprietorial approach to the Arctic. And that's why if the Arctic ever does become mainstream international politics, international geopolitics, there will be issues that Moscow and Beijing will need to try and resolve or at least manage.
Yeah, let me just add a couple of small nuances. Unfortunately, we lost the gentleman who was looking for areas of cooperation, but hopefully he'll come back and watch the webcast. Because, I think that all of us are struggling to basically, he's back, to create a kind of a frame for that of cooperation, but by trying to manage expectations. I think, the three of us have been, and all of you in the audience, we've been around this block many times. We all remember the reset. Which was meant to be, setting a different tone and look for areas of cooperation. But it wasn't about the relationship with Russia per se. It was more about how we could work with Russia on areas of cooperation, on two critical areas, which was Afghanistan and in Iran and the nuclear deal. And then whether it would be possible to compartmentalize the rest of our relationship. Well, Russia is looking for its own reset now, and I think has come right outside of all fists flying during this presidential campaign to try to get to be right at the top of the agenda so that we don't try to ignore it again. Because there is a tendency of US administrations to come in and just try to write Russia off. I mean, many of you will remember in 2000, Condoleezza Rice's article in Foreign Affairs, which relegated Russia to a not particularly especially important relationship, saying that this was the end of 16 years or, however, since the Bush administration, actually wouldn't be 16 years at that point, 9 years, I suppose. My math is obviously pretty dodgy here. Since the late Bush administration all the way through the Clinton administration of putting Russia at the top of the agenda, and that was going to stop. So I think, we've seen in the last several years that Putin and the Kremlin have made a bid to make sure that that does not happen again. And I think that that's where Syria comes in. So I think what we're trying to say is that cooperation is fraught with difficulty. I do, however, think that Syria is extremely important for Russia for a number of other reasons that, in fact, might open up for some area of cooperation. It is actually intricately linked into some of Russia's own domestic politics, into Chechnya and to Russia's own concerns about the radicalization of its Muslim population. I mean, many people in this audience, I'm looking at Philip Rumler, who's worked on this for decades, know about the importance of the indigenous Muslim population. I'm saying indigenous, which sounds a little odd, but just think that Islam is the older religion pretty much in, at least in the Volga and the Tatar regions. This is not a religion of migrants, although migration from Central Asia has swelled that in Russia, but by what the Russians would say, natural means. Moscow has the largest Muslim population of any European city, and it is a European city. So Russia has the same concerns that everybody else does about this, the Islamicization of terrorism and of radicalization. And they very much want to be part of the action in Syria to make sure that there is no blowback. So in that regard, I think Putin actually has been very sincere about finding ways of working with the United States. There were warnings of 9/11, the plot, that were just made rather obliquely, that Putin made just before the assassination of Massoud in Afghanistan. But we never really found the language to work together. And we do have very different ideas of how to approach it. We try to kind of pass, as you're pointing out, the delicate differences among various extremist groups, where for Putin they're all extremists, and that's the way that their counter-terror operations operate, and they don't want to deal with these niceties, which is why there's been so much pressure on the United States to do something about al-Nusra. The Russians have also conflated US support for the opposition with colour revolutions. They want to keep Assad in place, not just because he is the last bastion for them of a vaguely now secular Syria that could be somehow cobbled back together, but also because they don't want to see the overthrow of, in their view, a legitimate leader. So lots of things are freighted on what's going on in Syria. Russia also, however, does not want to be, I think, the dominant power in the Middle East. I think it would be a nightmare for Moscow if President-elect Trump decides, okay, that's it, we're done, we're gone. Because that would leave Russia exposed in the middle of a lot of fighting with some other key partners for Russia. I think there's a lot of evidence pointing towards the fact that Russia might have intervened in Syria because it didn't want to see Iran get the upper hand.
Yeah.
I mean, although there is a very close, important relationship with Iran, the idea of Iran and Hezbollah dominating Syria was anathema for Moscow as well.
Absolutely.
I mean, Moscow wanted to be in the Iran nuclear deal, not just us, because they didn't want to have Iran running off with a nuclear weapon, although they thought they couldn't be stopped. They did actually want to work on non-proliferation because that dilutes their own importance as a nuclear power. They didn't think that Iran would be a threat to them, but they did want to find a way of trying to manage this for as long as possible.
Yeah.
And that's the same with Syria. They need the United States in the action to help to manage and mitigate the other relations. They don't want the Israelis to get pulled in and start attacking Syria. Russia has the same problem we do, as we have a strange configuration of allies in the Middle East. And they have Iran and Israel. We don't have Iran, but we do have Israel. And then they have Egypt, and they're still trying to figure out what to do with Turkey. And then they're very nervous about the Gulf, about Saudi Arabia. They wanted to act against the prospect of Saudi dominance or Qatar dominance as well. So I think Russia, it's not in a quagmire that we anticipated, but it is also in a very delicate situation. And it's going to be balancing different things from what we're seeking to balance. They're not worried uppermost about the humanitarian catastrophe. They're not really worried about what the Europeans may be worrying about the mass refugees and migrants, because very few are going to Russia. And ultimately, they're going to be always looking for what is going to be the blowback for them. Exactly. Which means that whenever we're looking for areas of cooperation, we have to be, and I think this is really the message we're trying to send, careful about our expectations.
Yeah.
I mean, cautiously pessimistic or optimistically pessimistic, pessimistically optimistic. I mean, we have to be, in some way, I think, very careful about how we approach things and not try to, as we've all been saying, make a big grand bargain. Yeah. I mean, we can't trade off what's happening in Syria for what's going on in Ukraine. That has its own dynamic. We have to be very careful about relations in the Arctic. But I do think that we have to look at Russia in all of these contexts, because there is going to be some blow-up that we're going to have to manage on a number of fronts with Russia over the next year in particular, I think.
I was just going to add quickly, I think it's important that although Russia obviously has grand ambition in the sense that I believe anyway, that it wants to be recognized as a global great power, it doesn't actually want the responsibilities of being a global great power and a great imperial power. So I don't believe that it wants to recreate the USSR, not because Putin's a nice guy, or misunderstood guy, as Stephen Cohen would argue, but because it's a pain in the ass to try and run a massive multinational state. To assume that kind of imperial burden, no thank you. So what I think ultimately that Putin wants is power and respect and status, but with a minimum of responsibility.
Just one thing to add before giving Tad the last observation. That actually does point to what could be a very serious blow-up with the Trump administration over the United Nations.
Yeah.
I mean, if John Bolton is picked to be Secretary of State, now I'm missing the news, so I have no idea about what's happening here, and goes on basically the usual tack of let's get rid of the UN, that would be an absolute disaster for US-Russian relations, because in everything that we've described here, that's the one area, it's not the concert of Europe, but it is the global concert with the National Security Council. Although the UK and France may be on there, they're not really seen as the big members anymore. It's a long time since Potsdam and Yalta and World War II. And Russia wants to make sure that it can secure its position there and maintain that veto, because that's the model that it wants to approach on certainly a multi-regional scale. And making claims to the Arctic has been done actually largely through the UN, the Sea of Okhotsk, and asking to make sure that becomes Russian waters, and to try to get recognition of the Russian continental shelf, to make sure it doesn't become global commons. There's all kinds of things that Russia needs the UN for. It's the enforcer of rules on others, even if Russia gets to have a veto. So we could really blow up right from the outset if we want to have a way of finding a new footing, but if we go right in immediately to let's get rid of the United Nations.
Yeah,
and Ted.
You can't declare yourself to be a great power. Other great powers have to recognize you as a great power. So to the extent that Russia doesn't want any obligations as a great power, it's not going to be recognized as one. And China's far more sensible in this regard. They declare themselves not to be a great power, so they don't have to incur the obligations, right?
Very good, very good.
Well, maybe that's a kind of a lesson for us all. Yes, probably not to make too many declarations.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Move forward. But anyway, let's. If anybody wants a last question, perhaps we can. Yes, sir. Yes. Yeah, that's make it a good one.
I'll make it a kind of a broad picture question then. It seems to me that both of you deliver a kind of rebuke to realism, and you mentioned John Mearsheimer, who said basically, Crimea was America's fault. So my question is, and you both talk about how personality. Bobo talked about how personality is so important, and I think Ted with his chart showed how concepts are shifting back and forth. So it's very hard to say what is permanent. You don't see any permanent interest, that this is a kind of a phantasm. And I think both of you seem to agree that Russian foreign policy is, and I actually read Bobo Lo's book, I highly recommend it, that it's almost delusional in the way it's disconnected from the actual resources they have.
Yeah.
And a lot depends on how they think, and you have to get in, what Bobo Lo does very well, and also Ted too, is get inside these people's heads. What's in their heads is very important. So you can't deduce much from what's realistic. So my question is, with Ted, with his charts and the concept shifting back and forth, is there a core that can't be changed? And what is the give? What's the best case? Let's take Putin out of it. We have a median Russian guy, I don't know, Sergei Ivanov, or whoever you want to pick, and he comes into power, or maybe that's not a good choice, anybody you want to pick. What's the give? What's the range of variation that you could get? You have China, and Bobo goes into this book where China, they're basically decided, well, we're going to play ball United States, they run the system. Is that a possibility for future Russian policy? What's the range, the possible range? That's basically the question. Thank you.
Last question.
Fantastic.
Let me answer with a short illustration. I think a constant, I think Bobo and I would agree, and probably Fiona as well, is that Russia understands itself as a great power. Now, it's both commonsensical, but also trivially so, in the sense that, well, then what does a great power identity imply? Well, a great power identity doesn't imply anything except an interaction with others. So there was an opportunity after 9/11 for Russian great power identity to be vindicated through an alliance with the United States on a global war against terrorism. That would have implied a high level of cooperation with the United States. In Ukraine in 2014-15, that same great power identity implied conflict with the United States because of U.S. and Western involvement in the overthrow of Yanukovych, right? So you can't read foreign policy behavior off of an identity except an interaction with other states and their behaviors. I think this goes to Bobo's point about events and being reactive. I mean, if a great power identity is always understood and actualized in relationship to others, then you can't possibly predict a priori Russian conduct independent of the actions of others. So, for example, another great power identity for Russia is allying with China against the United States. And it's clear that they're trying to ally with China against the United States. They're trying to get China to understand the United States in the same terms they understand the United States.
Yeah, just I think the problem with Mearsheimer's realism and a lot of that kind of realist school is that it's anything but realistic. Because I think they imagine or reimagine a 19th century world which is dominated by great powers. And actually, I see the world in a very different way. I see the world as a disorder where great powers have lost the ability to compel even the smallest and weakest of states to their will. So that, yes, great powers can wreak destruction, but can they actually get people to other small states to implement their objectives? So a world where you think that great power diplomacy can somehow manage global and regional problems is, I think, well, that's a fantasy. And that's my problem with realism, that this kind of geopolitics, it bears very little relation to the world that we see today in the early 21st century. Now, a new Russian leader, what's the give? Oh, gosh, that's so difficult. But it's a great question. What's the range? The glib answer is the range is really narrow. But there are possibilities. And I think one possibility, I think it's about having a different mindset, which in itself is a huge ask. But what we do need to do is learn from those last 25 years, and we need to moderate our expectations. One of the benefits, one of the reasons why the Russia-China relationship has worked reasonably well is that the two sides have actually rather cynical and moderate expectations of each other. So that means that when good stuff happens, they think, hey, that's not bad at all. And when bad stuff happens and when there's disagreement, they think, well, that's kind of normal, isn't it? You know, they're so different from us. Whereas we, and the Russia and the West, have had ridiculous expectations and consequently massive underachievement and consequently huge recriminations. So this is a kind of negative cycle. So I wonder whether the way we look to this is we forget about these grand schemes, a new order, new Helsinki, security architecture, yada, 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 you know. But, you know, and we think about small stuff. We think do no harm on the basis, maybe, and maybe this is excessively optimistic, that in time a lot of micro makes a macro. Maybe. But I mean, you know, I don't want to be accused of an excessive enthusiasm or optimism.
I think it's a brilliant.
I don't think any of us will be accused of that. Ted, did you want to make another point?
I think it's a brilliant point. That one of the problems from the U.S.'s position is it always thinks that the other has to become us. Before you can cooperate with it. And so it's always looking for this assimilation of others into ourselves. And so it misses all of the small micro stuff that actually could lead up to progress.
Yeah, and that's actually just one quick element to wrap up where this comes from, because I mean there was a question about US attitudes as well, and getting back to the question about, you know, feelings of vulnerability. The United States doesn't look necessarily at China and expect China to become like us. But we've always looked at Russia, and because of this idea that Russia was part of that broader European civilization, it was the one that got away, or the Romans never quite got, or, you know, the Renaissance never quite caught up with, that we do think that they ought to be somehow transformed.
Yes.
And when the Russians were talking about a common European home, they were really meaning more being in the same space, and they had their own little unit, and they weren't, you know, kind of really planning on, you know, kind of joining us in ours and, you know, kind of using our furniture and all the rest of it. And I think that that's really kind of getting back to, if we had a somewhat different attitude about that, we might be able to move forward. Because one of the micro things that Russia and China does, which was very important, was related to security, reducing vulnerability.
Absolutely.
They'd had a very conflictual relationship for a very long time, and still could in the future over boundary disputes. They resolved the border dispute between them, and then they just focused on very pragmatic sets of relationships. And if we could find that kind of equivalent, that might be a de minimis way of moving forward and cooperating, without then the questions about who lost Russia. Because nobody gained it in the first place. And, you know, Russians themselves have been, as we go back now, just to tie this up to 25 years and 70-year anniversaries, bemoaning lots of things that were lost, but we never lost Russia. And if we could get over that, then, you know, perhaps we can move forward into the next 25. Anyway, maybe I think, you know, getting back to your point, President-elect Trump has probably never thought that. So, in actual fact, you know, that is one aspect of his approach. I mean, for him, it really is a fresh start. So let's see. Anyway, thank you very much for having us, and thank you everybody for